morning, everyone. I'm Meredith Dankos. I'm the lead pastor here at The Well. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. If you're joining us online or on the app, be sure to fill out your digital connect card there and let us know how we'll be praying for you. Let us know that you're watching. And if you're here in person and you have the app, you can pull that out. Let us know that you're here with a digital connect card, but also put in any prayer requests that you may have in that. So for some of you, that's a throwback to a fond memory of a show that we grew up watching. And there's a thing called collective remembering. And collective remembering is when a group remembers together key foundational stories that make up who they are. So nations do collective remembering. You know, for us, we have the 4th of July, where we remember our freedom. We have monuments and memorials and different holidays. Religions do collective remembering when they come together and they have certain rites and rituals around different stories or sacred texts. And then organizations do collective remembering. So where they start to talk about their origin story, like most of us know the story of Steve Jobs inventing the first computer in his garage, right? And that's the foundational story, a key remembering of the company of Apple, where most of the people who worked there were not alive when that happened, but it's part of their identity. And families do collective remembering as well. And it's about identity. It's about saying, well, who are we? What makes us us? What do we value? What's important to us? What holds us together? And early on in my marriage, I had to learn that, well, in my family, playing cards was playing cards, right? You're playing a game and someone's gonna win and it's a little competitive. Steve's family, playing cards was actually just an act of collective remembering. So instead of playing the game, they just told the same stories each time in the same exact order. And so, I'd sit there and they'd go on and on about how, remember that time when the dog got out, we were all out and there was no leash, and then Liz, his younger sister, who was like 4, had to hold on to the dog, and everyone else had to run back and get a leash, and the neighbor came and was like, little girl, are you okay? And they'd be telling the story, and then someone would look up and go, whose turn is it? And I'd be like, it's your turn. It's your turn. It's been your turn for 5 minutes. So let me know when you're gonna take your turn. So, but for them, it was this act of remembering. And the thing about collective remembrance is that it's based in history, it's grounded in history, but the point of collective remembrance is not to tell historical facts, like accurate facts, accounting for those. It's about telling the heart of the story, the meaning of the story. And so when we come to the Exodus, which we'll be looking at for the next 5 weeks, the Exodus is not a modern history book. And if we read it as a modern history book, we'll read it with the wrong lens. We'll miss what the point of it is. It is grounded in history. There are terms and references that are specific to that time in Egypt that it's referencing. So it is based in history, but it's not meant to be a modern history book. It's meant to be a collective remembrance of who God is, who we are, and then how we live in light of it. It's the foundational story for Israel. I tried to look up how many times in the Old Testament it says, remember, for you were once slaves in Egypt, or remember, I'm the God who delivered you out of Egypt, and it was too many times I couldn't count. It's a lot, right? It's over and over and over and over again. That's the reference that Israel keeps coming back to. Remember, you were once slaves in Egypt, so live this way. Remember, this is the God who delivered you out of slavery in Egypt, so therefore you worship him, give your devotion to him, and you live accordingly. This is a foundational story. So the Exodus is meant to be the heart of the story of Israel. And it's so foundational that, in fact, in Exodus 12, Israel is given a ritual of remembrance called the Passover Meal. And there's specific foods that they're supposed to eat in specific order, and there's specific words and prayers. And it says in that chapter, God says to them, you're going to do these things, and what's going to happen is your children are going to ask you, why do we do this? Why do we eat this? Why do we say this? And you're going to say, oh, this is to help us remember that we were once slaves in Egypt and that God delivered us out of slavery, because God knows without the ritual of remembrance, they will forget. They will forget. And this isn't just for them to remember, it's for generations to remember, because we know that Passover has been practiced for centuries, right? By the time Jesus came around, they were still practicing the Passover. Jews today still practice the Passover. It's this defining ritual that helps them remember who God is, who they are, and then how they live because of that. And so as we're looking at Exodus over the next 5 weeks, we need to read it with that in mind. That's what it is. It's a collective remembrance of what God has done for them. And we're going to see that this story, this physical story of God delivering Egypt out of slavery, is actually foreshadowing and pointing to the larger cosmic story that Jesus points us to, that Jesus makes us aware of, that there's a much bigger liberation that needs to come about for us, that there's a bigger slavery that we are all part of. And so this physical story points to that spiritual cosmic story, as we will see. So today, we're going to cover a lot of territory in a very short amount of time. We're going to cover Exodus 1 through 14. So I'm not going to read it all to you. What I am going to recommend is that after today, you go back and you read Exodus 1 through 14 in light of what we highlight and in light of what we see. But this is the deliverance, the actual coming out of Egypt. So we pick up our story in Exodus 1, where we're told about the Jews that had come up to Egypt with Jacob when he reunited with Joseph. If you want to hear more of that story, the context to how Israel got to Egypt, we did a series on Joseph last summer. It's online. You can go and watch it, and it's a really good series. It's a fun story. But we get to this point of Israel's history, and we're told, oh, that king died, and a new Pharaoh comes along, and he doesn't remember. They don't remember who Joseph was. They don't remember Jacob. And the Israelites in that time have just grown and grown. They've been fruitful, and they've multiplied. And the Pharaoh takes notice, right? And what you're going to notice, again, this is a collective remembrance. This is a bigger story for Israel, that the Exodus keeps referring to Pharaoh, but it doesn't tell us the specific Pharaoh. It doesn't name which Pharaoh it is. In fact, there's 2 Pharaohs just in this first 14 chapters, because Pharaoh comes to represent something bigger than the person. Pharaoh represents this force that sets itself up against God, this force of oppression and intimidation. And just like Caesar in the New Testament represents something bigger than the person, or Babylon begins to represent something bigger than just that nation, represents oppression. That's what Pharaoh represents, Pharaoh in Egypt. And so we see that Pharaoh number 1, takes note of this, and he is afraid. He's afraid, and he goes to his advisors, and he says, hey, this is a problem. These Israelites keep growing. They're going to outnumber us, and what might happen is if our enemies attack, they'll join with them and fight against us, or they'll leave. They'll leave, and we can't have that happen. So what does he do? He sets overlords, overseers over all the Israelites and enslaves them. It says he made their life bitter. He makes their life bitter, and he forces them to work in the field, and he forces them to make bricks. And brick making was awful work. It was hot and tiring, and this is not a 9-to-5 job where you show up, punch in, do your work, and clock out. This is 7 days a week until you meet your quota. You don't have a choice. This is what happens. And in this time, so Israel is enslaved, Moses is born. Now, we are not doing a series on Moses. We're not doing a deep dive into Moses, because we're not meant to read this story as identifying with Moses. We're meant to read the story as identifying with Israel, the nation, the people of Israel. So I'm going to do a very broad brush right now of what happens with Moses, and he's part of the story. He'll be part of what we talk about, but we're not looking at just Moses. We're looking at Israel. So Moses is born. Pharaoh had tried to do population control with the Israelites. So he told 2 midwives to just kill the baby boys when they're born, and they trick them and say, oh, no, they're just so strong, and they give birth themselves before we can even get there. And then he tells them to he tells his people to throw any baby boy that's an Israelite into the Nile. And so Moses' parents save him, and he's eventually adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. And at some point, he sees a Hebrew slave being abused by an Egyptian overseer, and he kills the Egyptian. And then he flees for his life because he's terrified. And so he goes to the wilderness. He's in Midian. He gets married. He has children. He's there for 40 years. And during that time, things do not get better for Israel. We read this in Exodus 2:23-24. A long time passed, and the Egyptian king died, and the Israelites were still groaning because of their hard work. And they cried out, and their cry to be rescued from the hard work rose up to God. And God heard their cry of grief. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked at the Israelites, and he understood. And so we're told the Israelites cry out. And there's 3 different terms used for their crying out in these passages. One is sighing in grief, bitter distress, and painful agony. That's what describes their cry. But notice, they don't cry out to God. They cry out, right? They just cry out because it's so painful, and they have so much agony, and they're distressed. But God hears. In fact, there's 4 verbs used for God's response. God heard, God remembered, God saw, and God knew. He understood. And so God, even though they just cried out, God heard their cry. And God remembered the covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even though they might not have. The Israelites didn't cry out to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They just cried out, but he knew. He knew who they were. He saw them, and he understood what was going on. And this is the moment that kicks off his rescue plan, his great rescue plan. The rescue plan he promised to Abraham all those many years before. And so, going back to Moses, right? So God hears his cry. The rescue plan starts, and he says, okay, Moses, you're going back. You're going back to Egypt. Everyone who wanted to kill you is dead. Don't worry. Don't be afraid. We're going to go set those Israelites free. And Moses is like, hold up. I don't know. I'm not really good at this. What if they don't believe me? He's got all these things where he's like, this might not work, and I don't know. And God keeps meeting him in each of those. And God provides Aaron to go alongside him to speak for him, because Moses says, I'm not good at speaking, and I don't want to do that. And so as he heads back to Egypt, he meets up with Aaron. And at the end of Exodus chapter 4, Aaron and Moses gather together the elders of Israel and then the people of Israel. And God says, show them the signs. Show them these signs. They'll know that I sent you. And so the 3 signs are that he can throw the staff down that he's given and it turns into a snake, that he can put his hand in his coat, take it out, it's leprous, put it back in and it's healed, and that he can pour water onto the ground and it turns into blood. He shows them these signs, but he also says, okay, God has heard our cry. God has come to set us free. And what do? They believe right away. They're not like, I don't know, who is this Moses guy? They're like, sounds great. Did you hear this? And they start rejoicing and they start worshiping and they're like, yes, God is going to rescue us. God heard us. It's very joyous, super quick to believe, doesn't last very long. So this is what happens. Moses and Aaron are probably feeling pretty confident because they were really worried that the Israelites weren't going to accept them. So they just charge in to Pharaoh. They're like, yeah, this is going to happen. And this is their first encounter with Pharaoh. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what the Lord, Israel's God, says. Let my people go so that they can hold a festival for me in the desert. But Pharaoh said, who is this Lord who I'm supposed to obey by letting Israel go? I don't know this Lord, and I certainly won't let Israel go. Then they said, the Hebrews' God has appeared to us. Let us go on a 3-day journey into the desert so we can offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. Otherwise, the Lord will give us a deadly disease or violence. And the king of Egypt said to them, Moses and Aaron, why are you making the people slack off from their work? Do the hard work yourselves. Pharaoh continued, the land's people are now numerous, and yet you want them to stop their hard work? And so Moses and Aaron, they walk right up, and their startup is real harsh, right? They say, hey, our God says, send the people out, let them go. And that is not the words that God gave Moses and Aaron, right? They just come in, guns blazing, and Pharaoh's like, I'm sorry, who are you? Who is this God? I'm not listening to you. This doesn't make any sense. And we see the second time that Moses and Aaron speak, that's a lot closer to what God gave them to say. And God told them, hey, say please, be kind, but they get Pharaoh's hackles up. And think about it. Here's these 2 outsider foreigners who are slaves, part of the slave community, coming in, telling the most powerful man in the world. They're Egypt is the most powerful nation. Pharaoh is the most powerful man. There's no one who can challenge Pharaoh. Be like, hey, let this whole slave workforce that you have, let them go. And Pharaoh's like, I don't think so. No way. I don't know who this God is that you're talking about. I'm not listening to you. He sends them away. And in fact, he's so perturbed. He's so upset by what happened with Moses and Aaron. He goes to the overseers and he says, okay, they want to go? Here's what we're going to do. They still have to make the same number of bricks, but don't give them any straw. And straw was part of making bricks. They'd mix the mud and the straw, put them in molds. They'd have to dry. They'd have to haul them to the building site. And this is an impossible task. So now the Israelites have to go and gather their own straw and try to make bricks, but make the same amount, and it's not possible. And so they start to be abused. They're beaten, and then the foremen are also beaten. The people who oversee the work sites are beaten. And so what happens, because Pharaoh, here's the thing, he is so powerful that he can make one of the dumbest decisions for his own self-interest. It is not beneficial to him to have less bricks made each day. That doesn't help him out with building the cities that he wants, but he's so powerful that he can do that, and no one can say anything to him. He responds as all tyrants do, with intimidation and force in order to secure his power. And so what happens? The Israelites, they're getting beaten. They're having to make the same amount of bricks. What do? They cry out to Pharaoh. They go to Pharaoh and they say, Pharaoh, there's got to be some mistake. Your people aren't giving us any straw. This can't be what you want. Tell them to give us the straw so that we can make the same amount of bricks. And Pharaoh goes, oh, you guys are just lazy. You're just lazy. You're not working hard enough. No, we're not changing anything. You better meet your quota. And Philip Graham Ryken says it really well. It says the foreman should have known better than to expect any sympathy from Pharaoh. This failure shows the futility of asking one's master to be one's liberator. The story of Bricks Without Straw portrays Pharaoh as an impossible man whose heart was hardened beyond the power of any human being to change it. The only force capable of compelling him to let God's people go was God's own mighty hand. And so the God that they had just worshiped and they were so joyful over, they don't even go to him, they go to Pharaoh. And of course, Pharaoh says no. And so what do? They're really angry. And so they complain to Moses and Aaron. And they say, when they left Pharaoh, they met Moses and Aaron who were waiting for them. And the supervisor said to them, "Let the Lord see and judge what you've done. You've made us a stink in the opinion of Pharaoh and his servants. You've given them a reason to kill us." And so now they're like, "You just made it worse. You came in and you ruined everything. You talk about liberation. There's no liberation happening. Now we're getting beaten and everything is more terrible." They're angry. And so what does Moses do? He goes and complains to God. And he says this, "Then Moses turned to the Lord and said, 'My Lord, why have you abused this people? Why did you send me for this? Ever since I first came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has abused this people. And you've done absolutely nothing to rescue your people.'" So Pharaoh's like, Moses like, "You made it worse. God, you haven't done anything." But here's the thing. God is not surprised. Right? God's not like, "Oh, Pharaoh did what? This is terrible. Maybe I should rethink my plan." He knows exactly what's going to happen because God has come to liberate his people from bondage. And it's not enough to take them out of the land of Egypt, because their bondage goes so much deeper than that. We see that in the foreman's response and the supervisor's response when they go to Pharaoh instead of God. They can only see Pharaoh as the most powerful force in their world. And so God knows that freedom, liberation, rescue is not just physical rescue from slavery, but it is spiritual and emotional in their mindset. And God says this to Moses in response. He says, now you will see what I'll do to Pharaoh. In fact, he'll be so eager to let them go that he'll drive them out of his land by force. And God also said to Moses, "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but I didn't reveal myself to them by my name, the Lord. I also set up my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan where they lived as immigrants. I've also heard the cry of grief of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians have turned into slaves, and I've remembered my covenant. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord. I'll bring you out of Egypt, out of Egyptian forced labor. I'll rescue you from your slavery to them. I'll set you free with great power and with momentous events of justice. I'll take you as my people, and I'll be your God. You will know that I, the Lord, am your God, who has freed you from Egyptian forced labor. I will bring you into the land that I promised to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'll give it to you as your possession. I am the Lord." And up until this point, they've known of God. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They know the stories about that. God had revealed himself to them. But God says, that's not enough. It's not enough to know about me. I want you to know me. I want you to experience who I am. I want to be your God and for you to be my people. And so he has to expose who Pharaoh is. He has to expose the force that is behind Pharaoh and how Pharaoh rules. And in order to really set them free, it's like Richard Rohr says, the truth will set you free, but it'll probably make you miserable first, right? It'll make you miserable first because you have to rethink everything. You have to change your whole mindset, the way you're living, the way you've oriented yourself to the world. And so God has to reveal to them that Pharaoh is not a master that you can seek liberation from. That's not going to come from Pharaoh. And he's also challenging Pharaoh because his words are, hey, let my people go so that they can serve me. He's saying they're not your people. They're my people. And that word, so that they can worship me, is the same word to serve. And so when we see that over and over again in these passages, it's better to serve Pharaoh, or they want to serve God. He's saying they're not here to serve you. You're the wrong master. They're not your people, and they're not here to serve you. They're my people, and they're going to serve me. And so God has to challenge Pharaoh, both for Pharaoh's own sake, but also so that the people of Israel can see that Pharaoh's not the greatest power in the world, that there is something far more powerful than Pharaoh. And so now now because they see Pharaoh for who he is, they're going to be able to see God for who he is. So the showdown between God and Pharaoh begins. And this is what we call the 10 plagues. Now, that word that we translate as plague is better translated as either a strike or a blow, but also a sign or wonder. And the rest of the Old Testament it refers to these as the wonders of God, the signs of God. So these signs of God of how his power challenges Pharaoh's power. Now, we don't have time to go deep into all 10 of them. There's a slide here with all the verse references. I'd encourage you to go and read all of them in depth, but we're going to go through them in a broad brush. But two things I want to point out as we talk about them. The first is each of these plagues challenges the gods of Egypt. The gods of Egypt were grounded in creation, and there were gods of land, there was gods of water, there was gods of sky. So either the plague challenges a group of gods or a specific god with a specific purpose. And so God is trying to show the Egyptians, but even more so the Israelites, hey, all these gods that you have known about and you've seen and you might think have power, they don't have any power compared to me. It's also these 10 plagues, these 10 signs and wonders parallel the creation narrative. And so it is an act of de-creation. And what we see is God, the creation narrative that the Israelites have is there's chaos, and then God comes along and brings order. God brings order and purpose. And so in these plagues and these signs and these wonders, it is God withdrawing his presence and allowing the forces of chaos to rule and do what they want to do, which is kill, steal, and destroy. And then as he intervenes again, he brings back order. So we see that over and over again, culminating with the 10th plague as we get there. So let's start with the first one is like the intro. So Aaron's got this staff. He shows up. He throws the staff down on the ground. It turns into a snake. Well, all the magicians, which are like high officials, they're the wise people who have authority, and they give counsel to Pharaoh. So these are not just like kooky guys. Like, these are important people. They can do the same thing. They throw their staffs down. They turn into snakes. But Aaron's staff swallows all the others, right? Swallows all the other snakes. And in Egypt, they believe that if you swallowed something whole, you absorbed its power. And so right there, we see a foreshadow of what's going to play out, is that God is going to swallow up the power of Pharaoh, the small power that Pharaoh has. And so the real showdown begins. They go to the Nile, and they hit the staff into the water turns into blood, and the magicians are able to do the same thing. And this just disrupts the lives of the Egyptians, and the Israelites have to dig to get water because the Nile is the source of life for this time in this place. And the magicians can replicate what Moses and Aaron do, but they cannot fix it. And Pharaoh is so stubborn that he's willing to make it worse in order to challenge this God. Right? He's willing to make people suffer in order to challenge this God. Then the second plague comes along, and this is the funniest one. It's frogs, right? And frogs just like swarm everywhere. And frogs are pretty gross, and it's like they're in the kitchens. They're in Pharaoh's bedroom. Like, they're all over the place. And the magicians can also make frogs appear, so they have the same power. But Pharaoh has to go to Moses and Aaron to make it stop. The magicians they can match it, but they can't stop it. And so that happens. And then the third one is gnats. It's some sort of flying, biting insect. It could be lice. It could be gnats. They're not quite sure. It's gross. It's icky. They're everywhere. Okay? And this is the first one where the magicians cannot replicate it. They say, surely the hand of God is at work here. Like, they're beginning to see, like, we are outmatched. We are outplayed. We can't do this. But Pharaoh does not relent. And so then we get to the fourth one, which is flies. I hate flies. If there is a fly in my house, I'm like a heat-seeking missile. I would say, I'm like, God did not make flies. Those are a spawn of Satan. So there's just flies everywhere. But this is the first plague where God says, oh, I'm now going to distinguish between my people and your people. So this will only impact Egypt. It will not impact the Israelites. So they can begin to see. He's trying to show Pharaoh, like, you're outmatched, man. Like, this, they're not your people, they're my people. So the flies show up, Pharaoh can't make them go away. Then livestock, so the livestock begin to die, and this Pharaoh actually goes to check in Israel's land to see, like, hey, did their livestock survive? Is that true? And he sees that it's true, but still he will not relent. And then boils, so some sort of skin disease. And at this point, the magicians are so covered in boils they can't stand before Moses and Aaron. They can't even show up. And they're like, well, how much longer? And this is where his officials start being like, hey, Pharaoh, I mean, I know you're in charge, and like you're a big man and big and large in charge, but Yeah, how much longer do you think you're going to let this God torment us? Like maybe we want to do something different. But Pharaoh, well, no, he gets more and more isolated. And then there's a hailstorm. And this one, they're warned ahead of time. They're warned ahead of time that the hail is going to come. Bring in your servants, bring in your livestock, whatever you can, because this hail is going to be big and bad. And some of them listen, but Pharaoh and his officials do not. Right? So again, you see, like God is working to show what's going on here, but they will not listen. And then there's a swarm of locusts that show up and just eat everything. And this is when the officials really start trying to push Pharaoh to be like, hey, this needs to stop. This is like everything's ruined. We're ruined. And then the ninth one is a darkness descends over the Egyptians and not the Israelites. And this is a direct attack on Pharaoh and his authority, because the sun god was the major deity of Egypt, and Pharaoh was considered the son of the sun god, the son of Re. He was the embodiment of this divinity. He was worshipped. His word was considered divine, the power of the sun. And then darkness comes along, and the sun god can't do anything about it. And it shows that Pharaoh has no power here, but still he will not relent. And then we have the last one, the death of the firstborn. This is the only time where we actually see the Hebrew word for plague show up, that this is a plague. And what's interesting about this one is it's very common in the ancient Near East to attribute everything to a god or to a deity, right? God does this, God's did this. That is the mindset. And so we see in Exodus that God struck down the firstborn, but we also see in Exodus 12:23, the Lord speaks of not letting the destroyer enter the homes of those who have the blood of the Lamb around it, that he will hold back the destroyer. And again, this is where we see the decreation, right? Because the culmination of creation is human life. And so what we can understand from this is the destroyer is the one who seeks to kill, steal, and destroy. And God's protective hand holds that back. But when God withdraws his protection, then the forces of chaos and evil have their way. And with the death of the firstborn, what we see is there isn't great rejoicing in Israel, right? There isn't like, yeah, you got him, God. There's just silence and then a great wailing, a great sorrow. That even in this moment, death is still sorrowful. Death is the plague that shows up. And as we go through this, we see two different things happening. There are all these signs and wonders, all these interactions between Pharaoh and God. And the first is this hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And in Exodus 7:3, when God is sending Moses to Pharaoh, he says, I'm gonna harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will resist you and you'll be able to see. And so we could read that and think, oh, see, Pharaoh didn't have a choice, right? Pharaoh didn't have a choice. God made him this way. Poor Pharaoh. But the truth is, to harden means to strengthen what is already there. And we've seen before God even showed up that Pharaoh was cruel, that Pharaoh was tyrannical, and then as soon as he even gets challenged at all, he chooses to make bricks without straw. He makes that the consequence. And we're told 6 times that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. He strengthened his own resolve to be against God. And at one point God says, how long are you going to go, Pharaoh? When will you humble yourself before me? But he refuses. And so as we get to the end of these plagues, we do hear God also hardens Pharaoh's heart, that God strengthens what is already there because, as one person says, you make your choices until your choices make you, right? You choose to go a path until you have been so shaped by those choices, your character is so shaped by that you can't unchoose it any longer. And so God chooses to use the resolve of Pharaoh, the character that Pharaoh has chosen for himself, in order to bring about his glory and his purpose. But he doesn't make Pharaoh that way. He strengthens what is already there, what Pharaoh continues to choose over and over and over again. And we also see in this that Pharaoh keeps trying to bargain his way out of this, right? With each plague, he's like, okay, you can go. But just your men can go, right? I'll let you go, but just your men can go. And they're like, nope, all of us. And then, well, you can go, but you have to do it within the realm of Egypt. You can't go to the wilderness. You have to do it here. And they're like, no compromise. And then you can go, but you have to leave all your livestock here. And they say, oh, nope, not a hoof left behind. Everyone's coming, even our livestock. Because Pharaoh keeps trying to assume that he's an equal partner here, right? These are two equal forces, and we're gonna work out a compromise. And God says, no, there's no compromise. And until it takes all the way to the decreation of death itself for Pharaoh to finally say, go. No conditions, just go. Get out. He can finally see that he's beaten. And as they are leaving, as they're fleeing, the Egyptians are like, you go. They're begging him, like, get out, leave, please. And they're giving him stuff, like giving him silver and gold and clothing and food. And in Exodus 12:38, we're told there's a mixed multitude of people who also leave with the Israelites. And as I was working through the story and reflecting on it, I was like, at any point, any Egyptian could have gone with the Israelites. Anyone could see, I'm going with that God, not these gods. But you would have to be willing to identify with a poor, underclass, slave group of people. And some people did. We don't know who all these mixed multitudes are. They could have been rich Egyptians, poor Egyptians, other slaves, but there's a group of people who go with the Egyptians. They see this is not the right place to be. And then God deliberately takes them the long way around. Says, as they're going, he's like, I can't take them through the land of the Philistines, because the Philistines, if they have any resistance at all, these people are going to turn back around, because he knows they're not ready yet. The resolve is not there yet. They don't trust him enough yet, but he's trying to get them to trust him. And so he's taking them this long way around, and we get to the apex of the story. And they are beside the Red Sea, this big body of water. And after the Israelites leave, Pharaoh's got a little bit of time, and he goes, well, that was really dumb. I just let all of them go. Like, we have to go get them back. And so he musters the whole army and sends them after the Israelites. And here, we are meant to identify with the Israelites. That's who we're meant to identify with this story. Put yourself in their place. Here's this ragtag group of slaves, right, who have women, children, slaves, and a bunch of livestock. That's who's hanging out by the sea. And the world's most powerful army is coming at you, right, with chariots, which is like the modern technology of the time. They'd be like us sitting by a big body of water, and most of the Israelites could not swim, right? They're not water people. They couldn't swim, so they can't swim, and tanks are coming at you, right? Like, that's what this is. They're in this moment where they're being crushed between two major forces of destruction. They are in trouble. On one side, they have oppression coming at them, right? Oppression bearing down, trying to bring them back into slavery. And on the other side, they have the forces of chaos, because water, and this is where the Leviathan, where the monsters of the deep reside. It is the force of chaos and destruction and annihilation for them, because it's unknown. And if you go in, you're not coming back out. And they're stuck between these two things. And what do they do in this moment? They cry out. As Pharaoh drew closer, the Israelites looked back and saw the Egyptians marching toward them. The Israelites were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, weren't there enough graves in Egypt that you took us away to die in the desert? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt like this? Didn't we tell you the same thing in Egypt? Leave us alone. Let us work for the Egyptians. That work is the same word as serve, right? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to work for the Egyptians than to die in the desert. It seems like they're in an impossible situation. There's no way out. And what do? Weren't there any graves in Egypt? Like, you brought us out here to die? It would have been better. It would be better to be slaves. It would be better to go back. It would have been better to have nothing change than to be here. What have you done to us? And we look at this and we go, what is wrong with these guys, right? Like, God just did all these amazing things and showed all these signs and miraculously delivered them out of the land of Egypt. And here they are going, why did you bring us out here to die? But the truth is, we can relate, right? Because we know those two forces. We know those forces of chaos and oppression. They're the same forces. They might not look like a sea in an army, but we know that when they hit, we are so quick to forget. We are so quick to forget God's power and God's provision. And we think, why have you brought me here? Those forces of oppression, the things that feel like I will never be free. I don't know how to get out of this. It is stealing my freedom and my joy. It can look like debt. It can look like an aimless or joyless career. It can look like depression or loneliness or addiction or a disappointing relationship. I think it just feels like I can't get free. I can't get free. I'm stuck. And it just robs me of all choice and all joy. And then chaos on the other side, the thing that feels like it will annihilate us, that it will destroy us because we don't understand it. It's so much bigger than anything that we could ever understand. A bad diagnosis. We hear cancer or something along that line, and we think, this will destroy me. It will annihilate me. It's chaos. Divorce or breakup, where you thought your life was going one way, and now it's all in upheaval, and you have no idea who you are or what life looks like anymore. Unemployment, uncertainty, watching someone that you love go through addiction. Those forces that feel like they're gonna drag you under and drown your life. And when they hit, sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other, often it's both, coming at us, and we're stuck between. We're very quick to say, were there no graves in Egypt? Like, what have you done, God? Why did you show up and you meddled with my life, and I let you in, and I let my hope open up, or my desire open up, and I trusted you, and you brought me here to this place. Where are you? We're so quick to forget. We're so quick to only see the looming trouble and the looming danger. And this is where the Israelites find themselves. They're stuck between an army and a sea, right? And they're in trouble. There's no way out. But listen to what Moses says to them. But Moses said to the people, don't be afraid. Stand your ground and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. Just keep still. What Moses does not say is stand your ground and fight. Stand your ground and fight. It's better to die. Throw yourselves against the Egyptian army. It's better to die than to be slaves. No. He says, stand and be quiet. Not stand and fight, stand and be quiet. To keep still means to be quiet, settle down. Why? Because God's going to do it. God's going to do this for you. Not you. You don't have any. You're right. You're in an impossible situation. There's nothing you can do. These two forces will crush you, left to your own strength and devices. But God is bigger. Quiet down. And God saves them in the way that you would never expect, right? He makes a way where there is no way. He's been guiding them by this pillar of cloud and fire, and he moves it between them and the Egyptians, and he tells Moses, put your staff, stretch your staff out. And again, we see the God of order push back against the forces of chaos, right? And the forces of chaos withdraw from God in this moment, and the Israelites are able to walk on dry land to the other side. And here's the thing about the Egyptians, because they are only pursuing Israel with the intent to oppress. They're not like, hey, let's work this out. Like, maybe you guys can come back. Sorry. Like, we know we weren't so great. We'll give you a raise. No, they want to enslave. That's all they want to do. And they're using this might against people who don't have the same military might. And God gives them every chance, again, to stop, to see what is going on. He puts that pillar of fire and cloud between them and the Israelites, and they ignore that, and they charge right in, and God starts jamming up their wheels, and they can't turn around, and it is not until it's too late that they go, oh, no, we shouldn't be doing this. We should turn around, but God withdraws his protective hand, and he allows the forces of chaos to swallow up the forces of oppression. We talked about this last week. He allows evil to judge evil, evil to punish evil. But they had every sign to turn back. They had every sign that this was not the battle to pick. And so the Israelites, they are rescued from their bondage. They're rescued from their bondage. And this is the defining story, not the story of them in their military conquest taking over the promised land. That's not their defining story, because that could be all about them. This is, you were a bunch of slaves who had no power, who had no say. You couldn't do anything for yourselves. You're stuck between two cosmic forces that will destroy you. And I made a way for you. I made a way where there was no way. You cried out. You didn't even cry out to me. You cried out, but I heard you, and I saw you, and I remembered, even though you forgot. And this is the story that Jesus points to when he's sitting with his disciples before he goes to the cross. This story of deliverance where he says, hey, we've been doing this for so long in remembrance of Egypt, but no more. No more. We're now doing the story in remembrance of what I am about to do for you. Because we still know those forces of chaos and oppression. We might call them sin and death. And they bear down on us, and they cause us to be so quick to fear and forget. But Jesus says, again, don't stand and fight. You can't fight it. There's no way out. You have no way out. Stand and be still. Stand and quiet down and watch what I am going to do for you. I will make a way where there is no way. Because the slavery that we are all captive to is so much bigger than what a person can bring about. It is bigger than Pharaoh and it is bigger than Caesar. And Jesus alone makes a way. He is our rescuer. And so we're going to see over the next few weeks, Israel had a long way to go to really experience the liberation that God had for them. A very long way to go, right? They find themselves on the other side of the sea, and Pastor Ashley's going to share next week. They are very quick to forget even that. They're so quick to turn around and go back to slavery. We are too. And so God gives them a ritual of remembrance, collective remembrance, over and over. Do this Passover because you will forget. You will forget who I am, and so you will forget who you are, and you will forget how to live. And we are given an act of collective remembrance as well, because we are so quick to forget who Jesus is. We are so quick to forget God's goodness, that he came to be among us, that we would never be alone, that we could see God with our eyes. No one had seen God before, and we can see God's heart. That he came and he knows our sorrows. We're told he's familiar with all your sorrow and suffering, and he took it all on himself to set us free and to remind us that you don't need to keep going back to bondage over and over again. And so in this series, we're going to do 2 acts of collective remembrance. I'm going to invite our ushers to start handing out communion. And we need this remembrance because Jesus says this, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. Because in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. That word trouble means to be pressed in, forces that press in. It's like being stuck between an army and a sea, where we have chaos and oppression pressing in, and Jesus says, of course that's going to happen. Those forces aren't fully defeated yet, but take heart, because I've overcome them. And when you stay with me, when you are connected with me, you will remember that I've done something so much bigger. And we need to remember that. And so in our series, we're going to do 2 collective acts of remembrance. One is what we've been doing for almost a year now. With each series, we have a memory verse that we put together. And they're on the seats with the bulletins, are also out on the tables. I would say take 1, take 2 if you need them. Put it somewhere where you will see it every day for the next 5 weeks. And this is our memory verse that we're going to be reflecting on. We're going to put in our mind to remind ourselves, now you are no longer a slave, but God's own child. And since you are his child, God has made you his heir. That you are precious, that you matter. You're not a slave to sin and death and fear any longer. You're God's child. That's your identity. And so put this in a place where you're going to see it every day to remind yourself who you are. We need to remember because we forget. And then we're going to do our order of service a little bit differently over the next 5 weeks. We're going to do communion at the end of the sermon each week. Because just like the Israelites needed the Passover to remember, because they forget over and over and over again who God is. They're so quick to forget. We're so quick to forget. And this is our collective act of remembrance, that no matter what forces in your life, no matter what feels like it is looming and pressing in on you, whether it's chaos or oppression or both, we have to look back up and say, oh, but God has overcome that. God is good, and God has not brought me out here because there were no graves in Egypt. God is doing something in my life. He's pushing these forces back to do something new. So therefore, we remember together that on the night that our Lord Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, and after giving thanks, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples, and he said, take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. Whenever you do this, do it in remembrance of me. Take and eat and remember what God has done to set us free. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup of wine, and after giving thanks, he gave it to his disciples, and he said, drink this, all of you. This is my blood of the new covenant that he still remembers, that is poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Whenever you do this, do it in remembrance of me. Take and drink and remember the God who makes a way where there is no way, who gives himself so that we might be free. I'm going to invite you to stand, and we're going to pray, and then we're going to respond in worship. Lord God, thank you so much for this act of remembrance to remind us who you are, who we are, and what it means to live because of that, Lord. Whether it is oppression or chaos that feels like it's pressing in on our lives, and we feel like fear is right there taking over, God, help us to look back up and to cry out to you, not out of fear, but out of hope, out of trust and out of love, knowing who you are. Help us remember you are the God who went to the cross to deliver us from sin and death, where you made a way where there was no way. We pray this in Jesus' name.